Okay, so I'm delighted today to be talking to an old friend, Adam Kilgarriff, and thanks for having me to your home for this conversation. I think we first met maybe 20, 22 years ago, something like that, something ridiculously long anyway. How did you first get interested in the study of language? Because I think if I remember rightly, your first degree wasn't linguistics, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I started with philosophy as an undergraduate, and kind of still feel quite like a philosopher, but jobs in philosophy aren't easy to come by.
No.
So after a few years in the wilderness, I went back to university to study artificial intelligence,
Okay.
thinking I'd get on well with computers, which I did moderately, but my course wandered across from that. Part of artificial intelligence is how we represent the kind of knowledge we have in the human head on a computer, and part of that knowledge is lexical knowledge, knowledge about words. So my route to linguistics was really, that was my route to linguistics.
Yeah.
Then my thesis, my PhD thesis, started being about meanings of words,
Right.
and that took me into the heart of linguistics.
So when you were doing philosophy, did you do sort of philosophy of language, Wittgenstein, Austin, Searle, that type of stuff?
A little bit, but I found it desperately hard. I found it not so much. I just felt irredeemably confused about what meanings were. So
Yeah.
it's taken me. So I failed entirely to get my head around what meanings were. But now, 30 years later, I kind of feel like I've got a fair idea now. I'm satisfied.
Good.
Satisfied for myself. So I've got a fair grasp of what meanings are.
Because meaning, in a way, word meaning, I can say, has sort of been quite a theme for your research. You did a lot of your early work on word sense disambiguation, if I remember well. What was that about?
Well, the basic problem there is that the basic problem, as usually stated, is that if a computer is going to understand human language, then it's got to work out the structure of sentences, so it's got to work out the grammar.
Yeah.
It's got to work everything to do with the endings, so that it knows that finishing is part of the verb finish. And one of the other things it needs to do is to work out which meaning of the word you've got, which sounds obvious when you're looking at a word, when you think, well, a word like bank can mean a river bank or a money bank, so the computer has to work out which. And then all of my thesis was about how that isn't too constructive a way of looking at it, because in fact most of the distinctions in meanings between words are much subtler and much more a matter of opinion and a matter of careful judgment.
Right. Because I think bank is often used as a sort of ready-made example. It's fairly clear that this thing has quite distinct meanings, but can you give us an example maybe of
well, I'll even stick with bank, that when you start thinking about banks of clouds and
so sort of metaphorical bank.
Yes, and also things like blood banks. I remember being particularly struck when I went out with my little brother around about this stage, and there was a place he went to which in the woods which he called the Bullet Bank, because there'd been bullet practice, firing practice around there in the Second World War, and there were lots of bullets that he and his friends would find in the bank. And I was kind of thinking, well, is that the kind of bank you get beside a river because it's it's a big earth like that, or is it the kind of bank like a money bank because it's where you store things?
It's sort of both.
It's sort of both, yeah. So even bank isn't really an easy case.
Okay, well, I'll remember that, and hopefully a clever undergraduate will shoot me down with that next time.
And shooting down will be most appropriate. It's all about bullets.
Of course. So that's a major task. Is it one that's sort of cracked by the sort of computer boffins yet?
Oh, not at all. It's one that runs on and on. It was one of the earliest problems, so people have been trying to solve it since the 1950s. One thing I did which was useful, I think, for the field, was that in the late 1990s I organised an exercise called Sensival.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And the idea there is that anyone who thinks they've got a good word sense disambiguation program can compete.
Yeah.
We'll set up a competition where we've got people to say this is the right answer here and this is the right answer here, and then we'll give them the dictionary that we used and also and then their computer program needs to try and work out what the right answers are, and we can score them all.
So you sort of had a crib sheet somewhere of the right answers, and they had to sort of approximate to that with their system.
And then we could score them all and tell them who'd done best and who hadn't, which was which is a good way of getting clearer about what the good technologies are and which ones aren't. If everyone does it independently, then it's hard to work out whether their results saying 93% are comparable to their results saying 88%.
Because the data is different. And
Yeah.
Okay. Is it indelicate to ask who won?
I think that, it's a long time ago. It is indelicate, because, and I'll answer this way, because we did the first one in, I think, 1998, and then it's been running every year since.
Ah, right.
So we clearly set up something that had legs.
Yeah.
And so there's been lots of different winners between times.
That's a very diplomatic answer, Adam.
And one thing that was established was, the original winner, the winner of the first one, everything was debated. It's academia, of course, everything's debated. He was a PhD student at the University of Durham.
Oh, good for him.
But he's not working in the field anymore. And some people would say that his method didn't follow the rules, but it wasn't very clear what the rules were on that particular point.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, I suppose the fact that it's still going is evidence that this is an enduring problem, i.e. there hasn't been a knockout winner, and there's no cause to carry on, pack up and go home.
No, and that's very much because you realise the more you look into it that the big problem is with the list of senses that you're going to disambiguate between, do you just have one money bank and one river bank, or do you have lots of others, including banks of clouds and bullet banks?
Yeah.
And what you tend to need, it's quite likely you'll need a different, we call that the list of senses, the sense inventory. It's quite likely you'll need a different sense inventory for each task, so it becomes a very task-specific sort of problem.
I suppose also people approaching your competition with a system may have actually developed a different sense inventory, if you call it, themselves. So they'll then have the problem of sort of retooling that to work with your sense and what might have worked with their sense. I can see it's quite a complicated thing. I don't think I'm ever going to enter the competition by those consequences.
One way that's taken it to deal with the sense inventory problem is, we did have one simple task back in 1998. Now there's a variety of tasks, and some of them ask questions like, which of these sentences are most similar?
Right.
And another approach to it is, which of them have the same translation in another language? So these are all trying to get round the difficulty of agreeing on one sense inventory.
And what do people use these systems for once they're developed? Say if they did produce the knockout system, what type of applications are there for this, other than perhaps dictionary building?
Yes, well, all sorts of big players are interested. Google would love to have word sense disambiguation, so it could disambiguate your query to suit the and disambiguate all the documents on the web so that it can match them up more accurately.
Right.
And while on a big scale,
for queries as well, it could be helpful. So you could say what type of bank you wanted to visit.
And quite a lot of their effort applies to not so much the ambiguity of ordinary English words, but the ambiguity of names as well. Have we got the same as James Taylor here and there, and things like that. So some of the same techniques have been used, but applied to the slightly different domain of disambiguating names.
Well, I wonder whether this all links then to another major interest I think that you've had over the years, which is in the raw data itself, the corpora, because my suspicion is that not much of that work would be possible without large bodies of examples from which to draw, so corpora as I'd call them. And you've done a lot of really interesting work, say for example in areas as diverse as Weber's corpus. I know you've done a lot there, and also a lot of work on measures for comparing and contrasting corpora. So tell me a bit about that. What's your interest in that?
Well, once you start dealing with anything in language where you want, my inclination, this goes back to me studying philosophy, is very much we need to have things firmly based on data. We need to be empirical. We need to be empiricists in the tradition from David Hume, so that means we need to base the word sense disambiguation work and other sorts of work on data, which has happened in dictionaries for a long time already. They've been dictionary publishers have been pioneers in gathering corpora, with early work taking place with Collins and University of Birmingham, and then lots of other work with players like Oxford University Press and Longman, where I used to work. And so there you start thinking more and more about what a corpus of English should consist of. There's all sorts of fundamental questions like, well, how much do we want written language and how much do we want spoken language? How much do we, in this conversation, this is a conversation that perhaps a few thousand people will hear, does that make it, is it one language event because Tony and I are speaking just once, or is it several thousand language events? Because there's several
Played
thousand.
so many times, yes.
So all of
Late
these.
to the Milkman, just one event, published novel, potentially millions of events.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so that's another whole raft of issues, and another one that I care about an awful lot is when you're talking about is about the domain. If you've got doctors talking about my case, then they're likely to use lots of technical vocabulary and lots of words that I hadn't heard, maybe in types of sentences that I don't usually
professional
use.
jargon.
Yeah. And then if the doctor then turns to me and starts talking to me, they'll use one different sort of language with less technical terms so I can understand. And then if I'm talking to my friends about my illness, then that'll be different again because it'll be more relaxed and less formal. So so there's all these different ways of speaking. And if we want to get scientific about corpora, then we've got the challenge. Well, which of those are the ones to include in the corpora?
What are we modelling?
What are we modelling, and how can we tell the difference between the kind of language that the doctors speak to each other and the kind of language that I speak to my friends? And that's the research question that sort of drives me on, because no one's really got that much of an answer to how we do that yet, but it's ever so interesting and gets down to the fundamentals of what language is, I think.
Yes. And the very important role that context in all of its forms takes, as social context, physical context, etc., which was somewhat overlooked, of course, when the subject was terrifically formal and worried about deep structures and whatnot. We didn't really worry about context, that perhaps Hallidayans certainly did, but it is an interesting area to look at. So what type of work have you been doing sort of contrasting those different types of language then? Because if you say, for example, gather one-to-one conversational English like this, and you want to see how different it is perhaps from me talking to a lecture theatre or you talking to a lecture theatre, do you need some way of measuring how different these things are, or do you just declare they are different?
Oh, we definitely want to measure the difference. And it's quite hard. A corpus isn't something that, the only easy way to measure it is to say how many words there are in it or how many sentences there are in it. But if you want to say, but they're not relevant for saying what the difference is between this type of language and that. And the approach that the simplest way to make some progress there, which is one I've pursued at some length, is to say, well, let's start out by saying we'll count all the words in the corpus, so we've got a word list, and maybe the will be the most common with 6 million hits, and then of, and then to, and then I, with their numbers of hits. Then that's a good starting point for something that's more manageable for making, for counting, for measuring distances. So I've then pioneered different measures that compare that frequency list for corpus number 1 with a comparable frequency list for corpus number 2 for each word, saying how different is its frequency from one to the other, and that's a way of measuring how far apart those two corpora are. And then it's to move on from there. If we've got lots of corpora measurements between each pair, then we can start to say which ones are more similar to each other and which ones are further away.
Group them together somehow, cluster them perhaps. And is that a different measure that you'd use? Does it sort of create these families of similar text, or is it basically the same type of measure that you might use to compare two?
It's the same measure between two different ones, or between a whole family. And now in our tool, the SketchEngine, we've got you can see a graph with where you've got all the corpora listed on a table with all the corpus with one column and one row per corpus, and then you can sort of see the cells of the grid is shaded according to how similar they are.
Great. So, what inspired you to develop SketchEngine?
The first thing that happened was when my friend and colleague Michael Rundle was developing.
He's at Macmillan.
Working at Macmillan, he was developing a brand new dictionary, and he talked about how he wanted to do it to me, and he described how he wanted to have a first pass where there were drone lexicographers or less experienced, less senior people to work through the data to find all the common collocations for each of the head words.
So he was going to hire an army for this, right?
And I looked at it and I thought, I'm sure we can do that by computer.
Yeah.
And I produced a summary there where I had a go at doing it by computer, and we called that a word sketch for each head word. We were working with about 7,000 head words. For each head word we would look at, we would go through all the examples in the corpus and find, if it was a verb, we'd find all the objects.
Okay.
And if it was and if it was a noun, we'd find all the verbs that it went to and all the prepositional phrases it went with and that sort of thing. And that worked well, and that worked well, and that went into the Macmillan English Dictionary that came out in 2002.
Right, that's the one that Mike Hoey was associated with as well.
Yeah. And so that was a very successful little experiment, all based on the British National Corpus, because we had the data for it. We had the British National Corpus, which meant we had the starting point. I mean, it had already been part of speech tact and things like that, so things were, all the other work had already been done.
Did you look at writing and speech, or did you just look at the writing part of it?
We looked at the whole thing.
Okay, good.
Then, and Michael Rundle and I presented it at, presented that work for the Macmillan Dictionary at the Lexicography Conference in 2002 in Copenhagen, and it was very well received. People were quite excited to see how the new technology could help dictionary making. So lots of clapping and everything, and then one or two people came up to me afterwards and
shyly inquiring.
Shyly inquiring, can I have it for my language, please? The Lexicography Conference is very international, and I'd shown something for English, and they wanted it for French and German and Estonian and Spanish and
well, that's the right
Greek.
man, of course, because you've been looking at other languages as well for quite some time.
No,
we went to India together, I think,
did,
in about 2000 or so. Yeah.
And in the first place, I just thought rather, I just gave a boring answer. Well, we haven't got the data. We haven't got the British National Corpus for any other languages. But after answering like that for a few times, I thought, I'm sure we can do better than that. So at that point, I thought, firstly, we need to add word sketches as an additional function onto an existing, onto a concordancing tool. Because the basic functionality for all corpus work is concordancing. You have to have that in the middle. And in the work I've done a bodge for that with the Macmillan work, which was good enough for their purposes but didn't really go very far. So that was, so then I needed to find somebody who I could work with, and I asked a couple of other people and they were possible candidates like Mike Scott, but he didn't have the capacity at that point. And then I came across, I was put in touch with Pavel Rickley, a software engineer from the Czech Republic who'd just built a corpus system, and he came to one of our workshops and demonstrated it, and it was dazzlingly fast, and he was very keen to work with me, and I was very keen to work with him, and he had the one set of skills and I had the other, and it looked like that would work together.
And you've got some sort of interesting overlaps, because he's worked on some corpus comparison measures as well, like log dice, was it?
Yes, that was so he had quite a lot to bring on the mathematical as well as the software engineering side, and also so that was so from that marriage of the concordancing system and the added functionality of the word sketches, we've got the SketchEngine, which was published, or which became available in 2004, first with Oxford University Press, were the sort of lead users of that. They were keen to use it as soon as it existed, sort of.
Right, sort of with the Oxford English Dictionary, was that?
More one or two of the other. It gets used, the Oxford English Dictionary. That's all changed. It's interesting to see it's changed. In the old days, there were lots of different dictionaries from Oxford, like the Concise was the best known one. And then there was also the Oxford Dictionary of English, which people did tend to confuse with the Oxford English Dictionary. In fact, they were quite different. But now that everything's online, Oxford find it necessary to bridge those gaps rather more. Everyone thinks of it as the Oxford English Dictionary, although the one part and the one department of the press is more about the history of the language, and the other is about the contemporary language.
Right.
In fact, it becomes with an online website, you need to cover both angles.
Yes.
So that was the birth of the SketchEngine, and we then had which we set up as a web service, so that anyone can log on and start exploring what they want to explore. I set up a company, Lexical Computing, which was, if you like, the vehicle for having the vehicle for
Developing,
promoting and selling and maintaining. Quite often in academic projects there's a big problem, particularly academic software projects. People make it and they're very proud to show it to the world and demonstrate what can be done, and then there's no one to maintain it.
So it goes in a box and it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. So it's quite nice. So for a tool like a web service, it's very nice that it actually works better. I think that it's in a commercial company. In our company, so what we do is the SketchEngine, so we're fully committed to that.
Yeah.
That's
if it's not working, your income flow is gone.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. I suppose if it's not working, well, you can get on with your next paper or something.
Yeah. So since then we've firstly got most of the UK dictionary publishers using it, and dictionary publishers elsewhere around the world. And then we also discovered that it worked well with people like the Estonian and Czech national corpus projects,
Right.
where they're very keen to do things for their language. They don't want they don't want to spend too much on developing the software. They want to deal with the language, and then that's a good marriage because I can provide the
And why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah. So we've now got, I think, 9 different national language institutes who are using the SketchEngine for their language.
But you really rose to that challenge about working with other languages, because I think you can work with many more languages than just those 9 in SketchEngine from memory.
Yes, we start out, the software's language independent, so if we can gather a corpus, then we can put the corpus into SketchEngine, preferably with part of speech tagging and grammatical processing, which requires working with people who are experts in that language. So I've had lots of nice collaborations with people in China for Chinese, and with people in Slovenia for Slovene, and with people in Estonia for Estonian, and then in fact now we've got about 60 languages in the SketchEngine. There's a wonderful website called Ethnologue with lots and lots of data about all the languages of the world. And my favourite table in Ethnologue, which they provide online, is one that ranks the languages by numbers of speakers.
Right.
So there's Chinese up at the top, and then English and Spanish, and so on down to those many languages that have only a few hundred speakers. So I've looked through that list at length and tried to say, well, can we get all the top 100 languages?
Right.
And we're heading towards it. We've got about 60 so far.
Brilliant. It's a wonderful resource for everybody, because you gather corpora while they're available for people to use on SketchEngine. We will make sure you get the URL for this, by the way, because I think you can also log on and get free access to it for a short period of time, usually.
Another of the areas where... So one of the areas was dictionary making, but we also then realised, firstly there were lots of linguists, corpus linguists and other sorts of linguists who wanted to use corpora, and this could be useful for them. So that's another part of that's another set of users for SketchEngine. Also, quite a lot of people were using it for language learning and language teaching. The common complaint was that it's all right for me, the teacher, to use, but I'd really like my students to use. But they're put off, there are too many buttons, too many numbers and everything else. So one thing we did there recently was to produce a stripped down version called SketchEngine for Language Learners, or SCALES. So that's one that won't put off your students.
Okay, so it's sort of stripped down bare bones and useful for data-driven learning in this sense.
Also one of the common, a couple of other things we put lots of work into, a very clean corpus, so it doesn't have any of the rubbish that you
exciting features that you sometimes find.
And also sourcing all the examples for any search queries, so that as far as we can do it automatically, good examples come up at the top.
Right. Oh, right. So how do you find a good example? Because that's always been a problem. It was a problem with the early work, say for example, on creating corpus-based grammars.
Yeah.
How do you find the good example? The good example not necessarily being the most natural.
Yes. Well, it's a lot easier to throw out bad ones than to come up with very good ones. So we tend to work on the principle that if there are some good ones in the top 5 or 10, then that's pretty good.
Yeah.
An awful lot depends on data size. If you want to find a good example for ripping something to shreds, which is a perfectly ordinary English idiom, but not a especially common one, then you need a very big corpus in order to have quite a few to choose from, so you can throw out all the bad ones and still have some.
Because it won't be that frequent.
Won't be that frequent, so one thing is to have a very big corpus, and beyond that, the simplest rules are just blazingly obvious and untechnical.
Length of sentence. Or
length of sentence, not having long words in it, not having obscure words in it, mostly having common words in.
Yeah.
And also
avoiding subordinators, or
to some extent we haven't gone. We've done cruder things than that, such as avoiding sentences with lots of punctuation in.
Okay.
Avoiding sentences with lots of capital letters in, which can often be abbreviations and acronyms that lots of people wouldn't know. That's a sort of distraction within the example. Yeah. So it's not easy. So I think we're good at not having rubbish, but we're not especially good at having a particularly suitable sentence rather than a moderately okay sentence.
You're good at cleaning the rubbish away. Yeah, that's good. So where next for SketchEngine? You're sort of well on the way to conquering the world's languages. Are there sort of features or functions that you'd like to see added?
There always are. There's always a long list. I've already talked a bit about the corpus comparison and tools to support corpus comparison. We've got
comparing sketches as well. You can do in the system, which is very useful. Sort of almost comparing the grammar of certain words you can do.
And that's one of the things we're excited about that's in development at the moment is people are very frequently asking about change over time.
Right.
And we haven't really done too much on that to date, because it all depends on the corpus. You can only really do anything about change if you've got a corpus with data from time point A and then time point B and time point C, and to work out how it's changed over there. And there aren't so many of those corpora around, but there are a few, and often people are developing or special purpose ones for in their particular area. Or you can get all the newspapers from a few different dates. There's a big there's been a big project based in Siena on British newspapers.
Yes, absolutely, There's a Seaball group.
So we're going to have a tool that lets you identify the keywords for the newer material against the older, or even the key collocations, and we hope that'll mean that you can identify which words have got lots of changed collocations, which is an indicator of changing patterns of use for words.
Great, that sounds really interesting. Well, Adam, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work on SketchEngine, etc. as well, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.